had to bear witness to this genocide that's happened in Gaza for the past 2 years. It's sparked global outrage over the atrocities that Israel continues to commit against Palestinians. And in response, people have mobilized in their thousands and millions in solidarity with Palestine. You know, the Gaza solidarity encampments that swept the campuses and radicalized a new wave of young people, and overall just this widespread sentiment for Palestine at a scale that we've never seen before. We also are at a point in the movement where the rallies are getting smaller, less people are coming out on the streets month to month, and people seem more fearful of being repressed for speaking out about Palestine, whether that's at their universities or at their workplaces. There's the questions being raised about strategy. How do we reignite the fight to cut ties? What's happening with the Freedom Flotilla right now as well, and the question of humanitarian aid. And of course, as well, our own government's complicity in how we can actually put an end to that. The Vietnam War, the movement against the Vietnam War is talked about to this day as a point of really militant and fierce struggle against the Australian government, who conscripted young men to fight their war, and how the movement was actually able to generate that mass opposition and resistance to this. And I think we can look to, you know, there were the really high points of this movement, which were the moratoriums. That's what everyone talks about. In May 1970, the moratorium, this was the first one in Australia, which drew around 200,000 people onto the streets in opposition to the Vietnam War. In Melbourne alone, it was 100,000 people, with people rallying behind the slogan, "Stop work to stop the war." The moratoriums, they were more than just street marches, they were also strikes. The demos were held on weekdays, and between a half and 2/3 of the people at them were actually workers who either had to strike or had to leave work to be able to attend them. And the moratoriums to this day are remembered as a high point of the Vietnam War movement, but they could not have happened without the previous 5 years of organizing led by students and the left-wing unions, paving that way for the movement. On the day of the first moratorium in Melbourne, there were 5,000 Melbourne Uni and staff students that marched from the campus to join the moratorium, and this was well over a third of the number of students enrolled full-time at the university. And there were 2 more moratoriums that followed the initial one in Australia, which were a high point not just because of their size, but actually in drawing behind them the social power of organized workers. They showed how strike action was capable of paralyzing society through stopping business as usual and demanding an end to the war. And this struck a deep fear in the government that, you know, unless troops were withdrawn, strike action could increase and could become more widespread. And in response, in December 1971, the Liberal Prime Minister announced that all Australian troops would be withdrawn from Vietnam. The legacy that the Vietnam War has now in Australia is that a majority of people would say that it was a war Australia shouldn't have been part in, and that's a lot of credit to the actual movement in making the war unpopular, alongside the genuine defeat of the US by the Vietnamese resistance. This movement against the war in Vietnam was successful in mobilizing workers who hold the power to shut down the city, but also has importantly won us a lot of lessons that we should be able to take today into today's movement for Palestine. But this also begs the question of, you know, where to next for the Palestine movement as we see it today. A lot of us have nostalgia for the days where we saw people mobilizing, you know, in hundreds and thousands on the streets. There were the students just a couple blocks away, camping on the lawns of their campuses, occupying buildings, and we wonder as well, is there potential for more? How can we get to a point where the Vietnam movement got to where workers were going on strike, so long as Australia continued their involvement in the war? We're seeing the Australian government today bolstering its military support for Israel and the US in a similar fashion to how they sent troops to fight alongside American soldiers in Vietnam back in the 60s. And it's all part of an effort to actually bolster their dominance in the region and about crushing any kind of resistance to that at the same time. Australia's deep complicity in the genocide is driven by this imperialist agenda, and it continues to be further entrenched in imperialist war as Albanese cheerleads Trump's bombing of Iran and provides intelligence through Pine Gap. And this is why the Palestine movement has to take on that broader anti-war struggle to strengthen a greater force that has the power not only just to show up in solidarity with Palestine, but can actually break the link in the chain of Australia's imperialist support for war and genocide. and what can actually stop imperialist war. That's a broad anti-war movement backed by the power of the working class. This was the success of the Vietnam War movement and what, again, must be done for Palestine. It was workers that were a decisive force last time over Australia's involvement in Vietnam, and it must be workers that refuse to run society so long as the ties to Israel continue. But how did the movement get to this point during the Vietnam War? It was by no means inevitable that there would be mass opposition to the Vietnam War or conscription. This actually had to be built. At the start of the war, it was massively popular in Australia. When conscription was first announced, a large majority of the public actually supported it as men's patriotic duty to fight the threat of communism spreading in the region. And you had many men that were enthusiastically registering for the national service scheme. By comparison, there was a small minority of people that were opposed to conscription and Australia's involvement in Vietnam. Organizations like the Youth Campaign Against Conscription was set up at the University of Sydney and spread to other campuses across the country, as well as Save Our Sons, which was initiated by mothers who were opposed to the conscription of their sons for the slaughter in Vietnam. There were also individuals who publicly refused their conscription to Vietnam on a moral basis, and they were imprisoned for doing so. There was also, early opposition to the Vietnam War, especially in the more left-wing unions. In response to Menzies' conscription, the Waterside Workers' Federation staged a 24-hour strike in Sydney. The Seamen's Union of Australia later refused to crew the Bunaroo, which was chartered by the federal government to transport stores and equipment to Vietnam. However, this action was actually condemned by other unions for endangering, Australian troops, and this kind of strong opposition actually forced seamen to back down due to that lack of support, and that ship actually left Sydney fully crewed. And unfortunately, as well, at this stage in the movement, the anti-war struggle was too small to actually support workers' industrial action in the face of repression from the union officials. But it's worth highlighting as well that over the span of the opposition to the Vietnam War in Australia, the movement went through multiple high and low points. It had its lulls where struggle was lower, but at the same time, these points were still crucially important to laying the groundwork for more militant ideas and being able to shape the movement for when the struggle would pick back up. One of the low points in the movement early on was after the defeat of the Labour Party in the federal election of 1966, which was incredibly significant since it was the first time that both parties had run on policies about Vietnam and Australia's foreign policy explicitly. And while the loss of the ALP may have had a demoralizing effect on the wider movement, it also meant the prospect of electoral change was no longer an avenue for the immediate future, and as a result, many organizations were more and more orienting towards mobilizing against the war on the streets. And students were to play a really key role in building this militancy in the movement, who were able to take a strong political stance on Vietnam and take advantage of their ability to mobilize and pave the way for the wider struggle. In the year following the federal election, there was a core group of student activists in the Labour Club at Monash who felt that trying to stop the war wasn't enough and felt that the anti-war movement had run out of ideas. So they decided that they would start collecting funds for the National Liberation Front, the NLF, or the Viet Cong. And that's where this, really set things off. The media, the Liberal government, even the ALP, they all condemned this action, calling it treason. It was seen as supporting the enemy, and that the enemy that Australian troops were being conscripted to actually fight in Vietnam. And the Monash Vice Chancellor banned the collection, and the Student Council, in response to this as well, tried to call a student general meeting to try to disassociate the Monash student body from fundraising for the NLF. And actually what happened was 1,000 students turned up to the meeting, but a majority actually voted to defend the Labour Club's right to collect the funds and oppose this ban on fundraising. So, the government tried to outlaw any kind of aid to the NLF, but this repressive move actually galvanized the anti-war campaign. The decision for these students to raise funds for the NLF was one of the key points in actually changing the nature of the anti-war movement, where it actually forced people to confront what it was that the movement was even fighting for. Was it for Australian troops? Was it just to get Australian troops out of Vietnam, or was it about supporting the Vietnamese people in their fight against this, systemic drive of American imperial domination of Vietnam and the broader region, and, Australia's involvement in that? And I think we can really see the very clear parallels to this question of, supporting the resistance when it comes to Palestine today, especially, when the topic of Hamas or armed struggle is repeatedly raised by the government and by the media. It is this kind of insistence on October 7 as an act of, terrorism and the justification for Israel's right to defend itself, which has laid the basis for the genocide in Gaza and Australia's support for Israel, both rhetorically and materially. But for the movement to actually unconditionally support Palestinians' right to resist their occupation, to be able to, point the finger back at Israel and the West as the real terrorists, is what can build a more militant anti-war movement that can break Australia's support for this imperialist endeavor. This is, a critical point that the Palestine movement is in, especially after Bondi, where this anti-Semitic attack has now been weaponized by Labour, the media, and the right wing to pin the Palestine movement as being the cause of anti-Semitism and terrorism in this country. State governments like Queensland have banned Palestine slogans like "From the River to the Sea" and globalized the Intifada under hate speech and anti-Semitism legislation. And it's no surprise that the New South Wales and Victorian governments are also wanting to ban these chants too. But what they're actually having to do is make that calculation of whether the movement will actually allow them to get away with it, or if it will rise to actually defending, these slogans. It is at this point where the Palestine movement has to rise to this challenge. It has to defend, the right for Palestinians to resist and, unequivocally saying, Israel is an illegitimate state. We support a one state in Palestine, and refuse to concede that the Palestine movement is in any way to blame for anti-Semitism in this country, and it will not be scared into silence so long as the Israeli occupation exists and Australia continues to support it. This is similar to what had to be actively fought for during the Vietnam War, where it was one instance where it was illegal under Commonwealth law to hand out leaflets advocating for refusal to register for the draft. Students, again, were the first to start this campaign of defiance, where they went to the CBD and handed out, draft resistance leaflets. And it was the militancy of the students that pushed staff and prominent academics to also start circulating these leaflets. And by the end of the week, over 500 people were handing out illegal leaflets, and over 100 people were arrested. But in doing so, by the end of that year, the public support for the war had dropped significantly from 55% at the start of the war to 40% that year, and they had smashed the ban, on illegal leafleting. And standing up to repression is exactly what the movement had to do back then for Vietnam, and what the movement for Palestine now has to do to build people's confidence and strengthen the fight, capable of actually cutting all ties to Israel. We need to shut down everywhere that has these ties, from our universities that participate in weapons research, to our workplaces dealing with Israeli companies, to our government that continues to supply the fighter jet parts. And it is the workers that actually have the power to shut them down, as they did at the moratoriums behind the slogan, "Stop the war," even in defiance of the anti-strike laws. And that is what our rallies need to be able to build towards and orient to be able to actually make those calls. But in doing so, the first step is for the Palestine movement to orient to the working class, and where they have power, organizing in their workplaces and in their unions. There's a lot of pessimism in the movement that the unions are just too conservative and unwilling to fight for Palestine. But a huge political movement with thousands on the streets for Palestine, I think, will inevitably affect the mood amongst workers, but it's just a question of how the movement is actually able to relate to the unions, how it can build up that confidence and consciousness for working class people to actually take up that fight for Palestine in their unions, rather than simply just attending rallies as participants. There's nothing inevitable about the unions being uninvolved in the Palestine movement. At the start of 2024, there were rank-and-file groups for Palestine all across the union movement. The scale of the Palestine movement meant there were continual opportunities to actually connect the massive anger around Palestine, to get workers organized. But in orientation to build that was and still needed to make use of this politicization. And in the past 2 years, I think the Palestine movement has failed to make full use of those opportunities. We can see that with the web dock picket, where there was a genuine mood for mass direct action, and the Maritime Union was willing to support, the community picket. Their members refused to cross the picket line, and this was an important stepping stone for workers to have the confidence to take action against Israel. Even after the company had found a way to get workers around the picket line, therefore removing the legal right, allowing their members to refuse to work, workers still refused to get on the bus and go back to work. But when the picket, insisted on staying longer than it was feasible for workers to continue to refuse work, it destroyed the credibility of the Palestine movement with the Maritime Union. Another example is last year there was a huge mobilization of unions at a major Palestine rally, and a lot of that came from Trades Hall, the peak body representing trade unions in Victoria, endorsing the rally and mass inviting members to that rally. But on the day itself, the chair of the rally was heckling the secretary from Trades Hall for not doing enough, for not, mobilizing people sooner enough. There are many more examples that we can point to where, the relationship that could have been built with the unions, unfortunately, wasn't taken up as much as it could have been by the Palestine movement. But, this doesn't mean that any prospect of mass workers' struggle being fused with the fight for Palestine is lost. I actually think, it's far from it. The war on Iran and Labor's budget has seen more anger at the cost of living and Labor's increasing militarism and drive to war. We've seen increasing anger at the constant pay cuts suffered by workers, the slashing of the NDIS and Chalmers' budget for the rich. At the same time, we are seeing growing anger at their willingness to commit Labor's willingness to commit an extra 53 billion taxpayer dollars to extra military spending, and wanting to build naval bases in Port Kembla and other places that put working class communities directly in the fire line of any future war with China. But there's still too much unwillingness from the main Palestine organizations to actually take up Trump's war on Iran as a continuation of their imperialist genocide, not as a distraction from it, let alone, for the Palestine movement to actually connect this with their support, with the support for the teachers' strike, the council workers, the ABC workers going on strike, and so on. The fact that the movement for the past 2 years has assumed that the problem is with Zionism and not imperialism for the reason why our country has ties to war has meant that they have been unable to make this connection or build the politics amongst the thousands of people who have attended the weekend rallies and what can actually be done more to drive the movement forward, to cut ties. I think, it's crucial that we actually build a politics within the movement that sees the need to take on Australia's own militarism, which drives their support for Trump and Israel and is committed to building wide-scale action, drawing in organized workers, getting people to refuse to load Israeli ships, boycotting their universities and causing a real crisis for the government by following the example that we saw in Vietnam, behind that banner to stop work, to stop the war. And that's what, we can continue to fight for to this day in the movement for Palestine.